Okay, hi guys. This is American history, and we're going to record our notes on the Korean War today. At least we'll try to get through as much of it as we can. The years, of course, of the Korean War are 1950 to 1953. And when you think about the fact that the United States was in World War II from, basically about the same length, it's really sad that we have not respected our Korean veterans more. I mean, if you look at my books over here, you'll see I have 3 shelves of World War II books, and I have 3 Korean War books. If you look at movies, you'll see a whole shelf of World War II. I have 2 Korean War movies, and I got one of them when I was in Korea, believe it or not. So it's really one of the things that makes me sad a little bit here. And these people deserve our respect, and they deserve our honor. So let's talk about what's going on and why the Korean War starts. It begins June 25th of 1950, and it ends July 27th of 1953. And it is quite often known as the Forgotten War. So why do you think it is forgotten? And it's been that way for a long time. Okay, good. Part of it is it's after World War II. So it tends to get hidden because World War II was so big and so all-encompassing of the world. Good. Why else? Question, was it a victory or not, right? We'll talk a little bit about that. Most people would have seen it kind of as a loss, and we'll talk about that a little later. Good. Any other reasons? Yeah, most people didn't even know where Korea was. In fact, they couldn't even locate it on a map. So here our boys are fighting over in this country, and we really don't even know exactly what's going on there. All we know is we hate communism, and we're afraid of it. So we send our soldiers to go over into Korea. Good. And for a lot of reasons, that's why we really haven't recognized these poor people, and they really deserve that. All right, so here's what really starts everything. So remember that Japan has taken Korea as a territory, and in World War II, they used the Japanese for their purposes during the war. So, for example, they would take 10 Korean soldiers, and they would have a Japanese officer that would basically force them to fight and keep supervision over them, so they would fight on their side. They would also take Japanese women. If you remember, we talked about this in world history. We call them comfort women. And the Japanese soldiers would take women from these territories like Korea, and they would tell them that they were taking them to work in a factory for the war effort, which they did do at home. They would put them on a bus, and then they would take them to the front line, and they would basically make a whorehouse, for a better word. And these poor women were forced to be sex slaves for the Japanese soldiers. When I was in Korea, was it 8 years ago? There were people actually protesting in front of the embassy in the Japanese embassy in Korea, and they've been demanding for an apology from the Japanese government because they have never officially recognized that they did this to their women. Well, recently, our new leader in Japan has kind of done some really cool things. One of the things he said, he basically recognized the interpretation is that we are sorry for what happened to your women. Some people see that as an apology. Some see that as maybe you didn't go far enough, because you should say, we're sorry that we did this to your women. But either way, they're trying to take a step in the right direction. Well, after World War II, remember, Japan has been defeated. So they are being forced to leave Korea. And that is being done by the Allies. The Allies at the time are our friends, quote unquote, the Soviets, and us. And the Soviets go into the north, and they start pushing the Japanese out, collecting weapons, and sending them home. The US, they start doing the same thing in the south. And all of a sudden, the Soviets take Korea. The biggest question, and we still can't explain this today, is why the Soviets didn't just take the whole country. Because they could have. They could have taken the entire thing. But for some reason, they stop right here at the 38th parallel. Now, you guys know I'm not a numbers person, but this is one number that you're going to want to remember. There are 2 of them. the 38th parallel in Korea, because it's very important even today, and the 17th parallel that splits Vietnam and the Vietnam War. Okay? So it's split. The communists now control the north of Korea, and the Americans remain in South Korea to protect it. But understand that there are very few Americans there. They were a skeleton crew that was just assigned to collect weapons and send the Japanese home. It was not a full army. You'll notice that the two Koreas were formed in 1948. North Korea's capital is Pyongyang, that you see right here. And South Korea's capital is Seoul. You hear about Seoul today. And I want to point out to you, notice how close Seoul is to the split, the parallel right here. That's going to become a problem. We'll see that shortly. The North Korean Prime Minister becomes Kim Il-sung. The South Korean president becomes Syngman Rhee. Now remember in our Cold War notes, we talked about how we selected certain leaders for different countries, and we kind of basically put them in there instead of having an election. It was the same thing here. This was our boy, U.S. approved, right? And in the end, the Korean people do not really care for him very much. But he was kind of Americanized in some ways, so we kind of liked him. And again, the 38th parallel was the dividing line between the two. Very different countries, kind of like the North and South in the United States during the Civil War. In this case, the North is very poor and agricultural, lots of farming going on. The South is very rich and industrial, lots of factories, a lot of cities. So it's kind of the flip of America during the Civil War. The North chooses the communist government, and the South is democratic. So they're very different in their values and their beliefs. And we see again, remember, we're watching all that's going on in the world, and we're so afraid of communism because we think they're coming after us. We see that North Korea now is communist. China is communist. The Soviets are communist. And we think that Stalin is pulling the strings in all of these situations. So the U.S. starts a policy of containment. Remember, we have a container in the fridge. The goal is to contain communism and keep it within its borders, right? To stop that spread of communism and to check communist aggression where they try to get outside the borders and they're forcing others to become communist. Now, my question to you before we go on here, we talked about whether we are a winner or a loser in this war. Well, remember, what is our goal here? Is to contain communism. Did we contain communism in Korea? Yeah, we kept it in the northern half of Korea. But because we didn't get to go out and beat the enemy like we did in World War II, it feels like it's not a victory. It feels like we didn't finish the job. So that's why there's confusion on whether we actually won or lost the Korean War. So here's where the war begins. Shocks the world. North Korea attacks South Korea. They cross the 38th parallel and they attack. Completely catches the world by surprise. The North sends in 135,000 men and they attack Seoul and other major cities and strategic areas. And they take Seoul really fast. South Korea's response, like they said, they were completely caught off guard. I mean, what a joke. They had fewer than 12 combat planes total to try to fight off this attack. Some, by the way, were piloted by Americans, so we're in there from the beginning. The North occupies the capital of Seoul within 2 days. So it was a really quick, huge victory for the North. But they don't stop there. Then what they do is they start pushing everybody down, and the government in Seoul escapes down to PUSAN, down here in the corner. And literally, the democratic government in Seoul, or from Seoul, has their backs against the wall, like to the water. And they are in trouble. They have now pushed us all the way down to the corner. Oh, I know what I was going to say. On your test, you're going to need to basically put the main events of the Korean War in order by event. So kind of look at these maps, and it'll help you figure out what happened first, what happened second, okay? And so on. There are different names for the war, depending on where you're from. In the South, they call it the 625 War, because it happened on 625. Look at a date, 625. Pretty easy to remember. In the North, they call it the Fatherland Liberation War, because from their perspective, they were liberating the South from the American people that were forcing them to be democratic. Kind of an interesting perspective. Let's take a look at some of the weapons. Pretty much the same weapons, tanks, and planes that we used in World War II, except the Koreans are using Soviet supplies now instead of us fighting against the Germans or the Japanese. So that's kind of interesting. For example, your article that you read talked about the T-34 Russian tank. That was very popular. We also will see like the Sky Knight, the Navy plane that we use. Remember, we can tell it's a Navy plane because the wings fold up, right? Because they're on an aircraft carrier. But we have a few new things that are invented during this era. First of all, we see the beginning of MASH units. MASH stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. Here's what they found. During World War II, we were losing way too many soldiers. Because by the time you took them on that jeep on the front line and you brought them back to the hospital, so many of them had bled to death. So they said, we've got to get there quicker somehow. So here's what they did. They made those doctors and nurses mobile, and they set up tents right behind the fighting line, right there. Now, does that put them in danger? Absolutely. And that's why they called them mobile. There were many times that they had to pack up camp and take off and get out of there quickly. But I tell you what, it sure saved a lot more lives of our soldiers because they were there right away. We're also seeing the use of this right here, the helicopter. So we're getting our guys back to the MASH units as quickly as possible. We also, like I said, see that we have helicopters used. Now we use them for reconnaissance, spying on the enemy, for transport of troops, officers, and also for evacuating people out of an area. So that's the beginning of something very new and different. The company that owned those helicopters was Bell Helicopter Company. They made a lot of money on this deal, and they will continue to make lots of money in the Vietnam War as well. Our aircraft changed from regular planes to jet aircraft. The U.S. has things like the F-86 Sabre jet, and the Soviets start their MiG series, the MiG-15. Now, if you're in America at War, we go into a great detail about all these weapons and everything like that, and the jets, and I'll give you a comparison, but I will just tell you that the MiGs outshine the Sabre jet, hands down pretty much. They go faster, further on gas, higher, you name it. So basically, it was up to our pilots to be able to maneuver to try to get any kind of victory in the air. They definitely had the advantage. So the guy in charge in Korea was General MacArthur. Remember his background. He was the guy in charge of the Pacific Fleet in Asia during World War II against the Japanese. He freed countries from Japanese occupation. And if you remember, he's the guy right here in this picture that signed the official surrender document with the Japanese. Okay, that's him. Well, let's take a look at what happens with the United Nations. Remember that the United Nations was supposed to be a non-biased place where the leaders could go and talk instead of trying to kill each other. But during the Cold War, they become an anti-communist group, okay, which made the Soviets really angry. They called the North Koreans bandits. And the UN forces were called the Blue Helmets. So the UN would send in people as a police force, and they wore those blue helmets around the country. Truman refers to South Korea in the United Nations as the Greece of the Far East. Because remember, we went in and we saved Greece from a communist overthrow. So he said, oh, this is just another example of how we have to go in and save them from communism. Let's look at what's going on with the Soviets. Remember that the Soviets were a member of the United Nations. Well, they wanted to basically take a vote about what they felt about North Korea invading South Korea, but they knew that the Soviets and the Soviet allies would be against voting, a negative vote against North Korea, let's just say that. So they waited until the Soviets and their allies were out of the room, in the bathroom, getting a drink, whatever, and they took a vote that said, basically, we disapprove of you invading South Korea. When the Soviets got back, they were furious. How could you do this without us here, blah, blah, blah. And so the UN decides to support South Korea in this war. And our communist nations are furious about this. So let's see what happens with the US. Well, remember we had a skeleton crew there in South Korea. When we see that they are invaded by North Korea, we immediately airlift the 8th Army in from Japan. This group was in Japan, kind of monitoring the situation in Japan, calming things down after World War II. MacArthur is immediately appointed to command everybody that's there. Not only the US troops, but he is in charge of the 15 countries from the United Nations that are there fighting as well. So we started with a bombing raid, because remember, we're cornered in Pusan at this point. We used 50 B-29 bombers that were left over from World War II, and we targeted North Korean military bases, cities, and bridges. We're using that technology that we have. We hit 32 critical bridges in this particular bombing raid. Now, why would we hit bridges? Good. We want to cut out their supply line. Because remember, they're all the way down by Pusan, and they've surrounded them at the city of Pusan, but they have to get weapons, they have to get food and supplies. Well, if they can't get supplies, they can't survive down in South Korea. So that's kind of why we did that. Good. Now, if you listen to the American soldiers and how they describe the Korean soldiers, they describe them as small-bodied, because obviously, if you've ever been to Korea or been around Korean people, they tend to be a little smaller in stature than your big old German, Norwegian, Swedish people like we are, right? So that's probably a little bit true. And they said they lacked naval and air support, but boy, they were well prepared and they were really good fighters. Remember that they've been fighting between the Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans for years and years. So they were very, very good fighters and they were very determined. This was not an easy victory, let's just say that. The North Korean fighters did some things that bothered us a little bit. First of all, they were very well-trained soldiers, so they were a very tough foe. But here's what they would do. When they would get into a city after they attacked, they would shred their uniforms and they would put on civilian clothing. Well, to us, that's a Bush League thing to do. I mean, you should stand up to your enemy. What are you doing, right? And of course, we couldn't tell the difference between a North Korean and a South Korean because they look different. They look the same to us, excuse me. So we thought that was a really crappy thing to do. Are they allowed to do that? Not fair. So we couldn't always find the enemy. There are 10,000 communist troops in Seoul at this point, and we're surrounded in Pusan. We know we have got to get Seoul back as quickly as possible, or we are going to lose this war very quickly. So what I'd like to do right now, I want to show you a short clip. It's about 8 minutes long, and it interviews guys that were actually there in Korea, and they talk about their first impression of Korea and the frozen chosen a little bit, and what it was like too. Before we do that, I wanted to point out this right here. I thought this was interesting. This is winter wear for our American soldiers in Korea. Isn't that weird? I don't even know how to describe that, but it's made out of leather, and it basically was a face mask to cover them up because it was like 40 below with wind chill, so horrible place to be when it was winter. Okay, I hope that you guys were able to look that up at home so you could see that a little bit. All right, the next major battle we have is the Battle of Pusan. This is the first really bloody battle of the war. Remember, the communists have sieged the city of Pusan. They're completely surrounded. Their back is to the water. The battle lasted until September of 1950. And we did something that was very chancy, but it was a huge victory for us. We decided to do an amphibious attack, so we used our ships, and we came around here, and we land up here at Inchon. Now you notice Inchon isn't too far away from Seoul, but the enemy never once in a million years thought we would land at Inchon, because at Inchon there are really high tides, and depending on what time of the day you attacked, your ships could get destroyed because there are really jagged rocks in that bay. So they never expected us to be there. We attacked Inchon September 14th of 1950 with 262 ships and 40,000 men. A lot of the guys that were there said it reminded them of the D-Day invasion at Normandy. Very similar, a lot of deaths, but this one was a little more well, D-Day was successful too, but I would say we didn't have as many deaths in this case because it was such a surprise. But with all the amphibious attacks from the water, the planes supporting them, it was very similar in that way. The UN forces attacked North Korean forces from behind. Tens of thousands of communists are captured in this move. 135,000 North Koreans surrender. Now that is what I call a victory. Holy cow. And they take back the capital of Seoul. So this is where MacArthur makes a mistake, let's just say. Now remember, we said our goal is to contain communism. So some people said, well, you should just stay right on this border and not allow anybody to cross. Keep South Korea separate, they'll be all right. But MacArthur decides to push the enemy north because he wants to get revenge. And I also understand that, right? I mean, he's mad. They've been killing his guys. So he wants to go and get them. And he wants to teach them a lesson. And he pushes the North Koreans all the way up to the Yalu River, which is the border between China and North Korea. The North Koreans cross over into China and they find protection across the border. Remember that China is an ally of North Korea at this point because they're communist as well. We, however, are not friends with China and we are not supposed to be in China. What do you think MacArthur did? Absolutely, he went after his enemy. And we went over that border and we started bombing the bridges in China. He wants to go in and he does. China becomes very alarmed at what's going on that border. So you know what's happening next. The Chinese enter the war. And that is exactly what the president was worried about. President Truman said, don't you do it. Don't you go into China. And MacArthur did it anyway. Because Truman didn't want to have a war with China. Because he knew if China got involved, it also meant we might be at war with the Soviets. And now we're talking World War III. And we're talking possible nuclear holocaust. So this was a mess. The Chinese come in. However, at the time, nobody knew it because they were wearing North Korean uniforms. All we would hear is the testimony of our soldiers saying, geez, where'd all these soldiers come from? Well, it's because it was the Chinese soldiers. They sent over 100,000. And China, meanwhile, is lying to everybody in the United Nations. They're saying, are you in the war over there? And they said, no, we wouldn't do that. And meanwhile, they were. So the Chinese come in and they kick our butts. Mao Zedong sends the Chinese troops in. Now, by the way, Mao Zedong can be spelled this way or this way. It is the same name. It's just we basically spell it the way we hear it, and there are different versions. Okay. Well, they push our troops all the way back across the border down into the south. But unfortunately, they did it so quickly that they captured some of our people, basically, or surrounded them. We have a bunch of Americans that are trapped right here, where this dot is, in the CHOSIN Reservoir. Becomes one of the most horrific events of Korea. The CHOSIN Reservoir becomes known as the frozen CHOSIN because the conditions are the worst you can imagine. Imagine the coldest day you had last winter, snow 40 below wind chill. And then imagine you're wearing regular combat boots without any cushioning and no winter clothes. You're wearing a sweatshirt, basically. And that's all they were wearing, and yet they were trying to survive. The communists surrounded the U.S. troops, as we said. The siege lasted from November 26th through December 13th, 1950. And they basically had to be evacuated. So here's what happened. And if you heard the first-hand accounts, remember the guy talking about how he had to leave his friends behind. And he didn't understand why we would leave our friends. This is why. We had a group of guys. Okay, this is the CHOSIN Reservoir up here, right? Here's basically the trek. They had to basically escape and go all the way down. If you look on the big map, they started right here, and they escaped out to this waterway where a boat was waiting for them to pick them up at Hungnam, this port right here. Before the guys left, they blew up everything in that port to make sure that the enemy was not able to use that port anymore. So a lot of debris in the bay right there. And they left a lot of their guys behind at the CHOSIN. Let's take a look at those stats. The United Nations had a strength of 40,000 troops at the CHOSIN Reservoir. Casualties, 2,500 killed, 5,000 wounded. 7,500 had frostbite, cold injuries, where they lost their fingers, their toes, feet, hands, noses even. And 192 missing. We still don't know where those guys are. The Chinese had a strength of 120,000. So you'll notice the Chinese outnumbered us 3-1. Their casualties included 25,000 killed, 12,500 wounded, 30,000 with frostbite injuries, and none missing. So although this was a horrible loss for the United States, what do you notice when you look at these casualties? Yeah, that the smallest group that was outnumbered 3-1 inflicted 10 times the number of casualties. So even though we were a small group, our guys, they put up one heck of a fight in order to survive. Looking at those numbers, I'm amazed that the United States even survived this war battle, but they did, and they inflicted a lot of injuries to get out of there. Well, remember, Truman wanted a limited war to avoid not only fighting the Chinese, but the Soviets as well. MacArthur pushed not only to go into China, but he even wanted to nuke China. So imagine using our nuclear weapons and going into China. So this is where MacArthur gets in a little trouble. Remember we said MacArthur went over the border in China? He bombed the bridges at the Yalu River, and he actually attacked Manchuria. He blockaded mainland China so they couldn't get any supplies in. And not only that, he went over to Taiwan, who was an enemy of China, and met with the leader and said, why don't you join us in the war? Now, is that his role, to go and talk to the leader of China, or the leader of Taiwan? No, that's the president's job. He went and talked to the leader of Taiwan without even telling the president. So, as Truman said, MacArthur has one problem. He thinks he is the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And he fires him. He removes MacArthur for insubordination, for not listening to orders. It was a very bold and a very unpopular move by Truman. In fact, that's why Truman doesn't get reelected. April of 1951, they kind of have a bold war between them. MacArthur sends a letter and he attacks the president. April 11th of 51, Truman relieves MacArthur of command. And then there are Senate hearings to determine if he was actually wrongfully terminated. Should he have been fired or not? In Congress, 69% actually support MacArthur. And MacArthur gives a really famous speech. He stands up before Congress, and at the end of it, remember this is our World War II hero now, right? He says, old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And he gets a standing ovation in Congress. And yet remember, the president has just fired him. It is a 37-minute speech. This guy, when he got home after being fired, had a bigger ticker tape parade than Eisenhower did after World War II. So it just shows that the people were really mad at Truman for this. But what a lot of people don't know is that when Congress did this investigation, they found out not only was his removal just, but they said, you should have fired him a long time ago. He had disobeyed orders even before that, and you actually put up with too much. So they totally said Truman was in the right. The guy that replaces him is General Matthew Ridgeway, and we will stop there at this point.